Now we're going to go to the middle of the panel here with Annalise Mannix. Annalise has an engineering degree from State University of New York and is a registered professional engineer. Annalise recently retired from the city of Key West, where she held many engineering titles over the years, including Director of Engineering Services and Manager of Environmental Programs. She also spearheaded the city's climate action plan. Annalise is now Director of Engineering at GW Selby Incorporated, a coastal structural and civil engineering firm, where she manages the firm's engineering and construction projects, among other responsibilities. Annalise has been asked to participate on this panel to address factors related to how the city itself must manage the issues involved and to provide any other perspectives that her wide-ranging experience can provide. So the question for Annalise is, this is kind of a long question. Disputes such as are being covered by this forum often put city officials in the middle, seeming to defend delaying progress in favor of rules some consider arcane. As one who spent a good deal of your career walking that line, can you discuss issues involved that the citizenry may not understand well?
Okay, well, thank you. That was a nice question. The City Commission has to wear many hats. They have to realize the vision that the citizens have, and since we have many citizens, we have many small different visions. And what they do is bring together all of those small visions and hopefully create a functioning community. Now, we have one City Commission resolution that says we are going to reduce carbon emissions within the city of Key West by 15% by the year 2015. Well, that's only 4 years from now, just about. And we have another resolution that says we will maintain the historic nature of all the structures in the historic districts. And there are many other ones, and many other resolutions that will also seem to come into conflict. And it's the city's staff and a historic planner's job and planning and building. It's our job, or was my job, to bring those groups together and come up with a solution that fits everybody's needs. Now that's very difficult. Very often when we start out, if you weren't born and raised here, then you arrived here. And very often we arrived here with a wonderful vision, we were on vacation, it's a honeymoon period, and we love the historic nature of Old Town. And then as we start to work while we're here, our priorities start to change. We have kids, the windstorm prices, insurance go up, and we need to now start cutting back. And we look toward energy-saving devices to start cutting back. And then there becomes a conflict. You know, I'm a homeowner and I want to be able to do this, and somebody else says, well, no, you can't do that on this property. What staff needs to do is bring people together maybe ahead of time, prior to the conflicts that exist, and have specific workshops on how to manage new energy devices into the old historic buildings. We can try different paths, like moving the devices to as far back on the roof as possible, but sometimes if you want to put in an energy device that operates your whole home, you may have to take up a good portion, if not all, of the roof structure. Now, that becomes a little bit of a conflict, and this year that will be settled. Now, we're hoping that staff will be able to work with contractors and look for the newer technology, maybe offer alternative technologies to reduce that electric load. If you can plant plants very close to the house, ivy, very much used over in Europe, is a ivy that coats the outside of the house, and therefore you have a completely reduced energy use in the house. If you can reduce all of your electric use in the house to a minimum before you put your solar panels on, then you can reduce the number of solar panels you have. So it's really important for all of those things to be looked at before you get to the point where you're selecting, you're coming to HARC and asking for the permit. There are other things that also have to do with sustainability and property rights, and that are important to the sustainability of the historic district. When you put an addition on, you have to maintain room for a swale so that your rainwater has a place to go. Very often when you put in a swale, that limits some of your planting, it limits locations for air conditioning, it limits other uses of your property. Sustainability also comes into your hurricane shutters. In the historic district, a wood piece of wood, not plywood, hurricane shutter doesn't meet the Florida Building Code for hurricane shutters. It's important that those buildings be here after a storm. So we need to look at not just specific energy-saving devices, we need to look at all the devices that are going to help the historic district be here throughout the years. Mitigation of carbon emissions is really important. The more we can do to reduce carbon emissions, the less we have to worry about elevating our homes and our businesses. A good part of the historic district is below what will be the flood zone in 50 years, right? It's coming up 9 inches right now every 100 years. So we need to do as much as we can to mitigate it, but at the same time, we also have to look at all of these other issues to mitigate flooding in the historic district. So I believe that that the conflicts that exist can be overcome if there's probably more workshops ahead of time. We can meet the city's 5-year plan for reducing carbon emissions by 15% if we select the best projects for the dollar, or the best projects for the particular home. Instead of focusing on something that's going to reduce only 2% of your energy use, we can look at some other alternatives that look at 15 or 20% of your energy use. And we can do that through staff involvement.
Thank you. That closes the introductions and the initial statements, questions, answers, whatever you want to call it. Now we're going to change focus a little bit, and you'll get a little bit of duplication here, but not everybody got a chance to answer some of the things that were already being answered, so some of these questions will cover stuff that may have been discussed a little bit already. But in this case, we're going to start at this end. The first one, we're going to start at this end of the board, and everybody will answer the same question. We'll start with a couple of fairly straightforward questions that shouldn't be much of a conflict, but we'll see. The first one is, do you feel that Key West is putting enough emphasis on historic preservation? And if not, what more should it do? Start at this one.
I'm going to borrow a statement that I heard from my friend Bert Bender. There are not enough laws in the world to protect these historic districts. And you've lived here. You've seen how the development has come in, how when a regulation or something in the guidelines can be pulled apart, tweaked, and undone by lawyers, by architects, by any person who has an interest in changing that regulation. So what we need to do more is tighten these regulations. And when I was on the HARC board, we spent 2 years rewriting one guideline. It was 2.5 stories. Now, you know, you can walk outside and say, I know what a 2.5-story building looks like. But the way a guideline can be picked and torn apart, you have got to be very specific about what that 2.5 stories is. And then we had staff go through the LDRs, go through the building codes, go through through stacks and stacks of material to make sure that that 2.5-story guideline was supported by all the rest of the laws within the community. So it takes a great deal of time and a great deal of energy to protect our historic district, but it is one of the largest national historic districts in the United States and is well worth protecting.
Okay. I just didn't mention before that we want to try to hold these down to about a minute or maybe a little more, but this particular question, since we've already done it, everybody gets the same amount of time, so we'll go on to Bert now.
It's a question?
Do you feel that Key West is putting enough emphasis on historic preservation, and if not, what more could it do, or should it do?
I think Key West is probably one of the preeminent communities in the United States in terms of emphasizing historic preservation and protecting their historic resources. And I think we're extremely fortunate to live in a community where people do care about these resources. I think some of the conflicts that we're talking about really are not conflicts. So I think they do have put enough emphasis on historic preservation, and I think it comes from the populace, not so much from the government, from the rules and the regulations that we have. And much of the conflict really is in interpretation.
Well, I think that more work could be done, but again, not necessarily at the end, at the beginning. People are willing to have beautiful houses. They're willing to have a historic district. We all love the historic district. But what most people don't understand is why you should do what you should do and how you should do what you should do. And it's like the Climate Action Plan. How do you reduce 15%? Well, it becomes too overwhelming in about 2 minutes for the average person to say, oh, should I do the light bulbs? They're $8 and these light bulbs are $4, or should I put in a solar? After about 5 minutes, you're like, you know what, I'll put it off till next week. And it gets put off. If we could spend money on having continuous education, whether they're lunch and learns or they're after, work at 6 o'clock every 3 months or something like that, that discusses historic preservation and how you can implement energy-saving devices and landscaping, and how you can bring it all together to have the beautiful district that we have or maintain it, then I think it would be easier for people. And people change all the time here, so you need to consistently offer these programs.
Jed?
Thank you, David. First, I don't practice law for a living. It's not what I do to earn my income. So when I take on a case, it's something that means something to me. It's a foreclosure defense when someone's being put out of their home, or it's an issue like a solar panel going on a home, someone who's interested in reducing their carbon footprint significantly, and maybe 20, 30%, and not being allowed to do so. That's why I take the cases I do. Do I think that the city is doing enough to protect the historic district? And I find it hard for myself to say this, but I have to agree with Bert. I think the city is doing a great job with historic architectural preservation. I think we have beautiful buildings here, and our clients want to maintain that historic nature of their buildings to some extent. Now, do I agree with all of what all of the guidelines that HARC has? No, of course I don't. There are some that I disagree with. And for instance, if you can't tell a window is energy saving from the street, why shouldn't you be allowed to put it in? Why should that material have to be an antiquated material like wood and energy and be single pane glass that lets all the heat in and lets all your air conditioning out? These are the things that I think where we get into, if you want to call it interpretation, I call it common sense. I think at some point we've got to preserve the look of what it is. It should look historic. On the other hand, if you're telling people that you can't put in an energy-saving window because it doesn't have the single pane glass that the HARC requires, I believe that that's an incorrect way to do it. So I think the city's doing a fantastic job preserving the historic architecture. I support it. The reason I moved to Key West partially was because of how beautiful Key West is. I think I agree with Bert again. I don't think that the conflicts are that dramatic. I think they happen on the fringes. You have 95% of what can be done in historic architecture can also be green and sustainable. We just need to, we're gonna fight on the edges sometimes. We're gonna try to parse these problems out. But I think as a community we need to come together and decide ultimately which is more important. Is it going to be the environment for our kids? Is it going to be preserving what is the most beautiful thing in the world? And I think that's Mother Mother Nature's creations, or will it be preserving buildings? So we have tough decisions to make. The Florida legislature made a tough decision when they passed Florida Statute 16304. It does conflict with some things, but these tough decisions are our responsibility for our children. We have to make them. Thank you.
Thank you.
My great uncle used to tell me, as a carpenter, measure twice, cut once. So I'm thinking hard before I answer this. The question is not should we stay historical, but what should we be doing to stay historical? I was talking to a fellow from a town on Cape Cod, and they have a historical district. And he said, in those houses there, you can use a 6/6 double hung window, and it can have 2 panes of tinted glass with argon inside, and it can have a vinyl frame. When you get to the city street, it looks like a wood 6/6. But 30% less energy gets in and 30% less energy gets out. Gets the job done, but it also meets the needs of 16304. Now, it looks to me, from my perspective, that HARC has not been following the law one day since they were formed, not one. And the ones who take it are not you rich guys in Newtown, it's poor guys on Emma Street. We're the ones who carry the cost of it. So I say, let's change the guidelines, let's change the direction, let's get some representation on HARC for those people who are directly affected. In Jimmy's district, District 6, and District, whatever it is, as the schools. So, more and better is my answer.
Okay, thanks for those answers. And now the next question, I'm actually going to start at that end and come back this way, so you get to answer the next one too. I'm going to time them this time, and so the beep will go off. And I mean, there wasn't any problem with you. I'm going to go with 2 minutes on the timer on this time. And this is a very similar question, but just in the opposite direction. And so you might choose not to speak as much, but anyway, this question is, do you feel Key West is putting enough emphasis on going green? And if not, what more should it do? Including what should the city itself do? I mean, like for themselves, not just for the people in the city.
Actually, I think this is a place where people of different viewpoints can really come together. There's an opportunity here. What we could do to stay green is if the city organizations and CES, and particularly HARC, could do demonstration projects to show us how to do it better. Give us, don't say, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. I'm not interested in that. Show me how to build a better roof and do it. And if we had that cooperation between industry, government, and the quasi-industrial outfits, I think we could move forward rapidly and make a big step toward historic preservation and quality of housing.
Thank you. Vic stole my answer. But I will add that I think the city has done a relatively good job when it comes to going green. We've done some important things. We've asked for 15% CO2 reductions. We've hired a consultant to help us deal with our solid waste issues. We're doing some of the important things. I think some of the problem is implementation. If you read Key West's climate action plan, it specifically lays out in there that we should be changing guidelines, HARC guidelines. It says specifically, change this guideline. A allow for white roofs, allow for solar collectors. Do these things, and we will get to that goal. That resolution was passed in October of '09, so 13 months have passed, and yet that work has yet to be done, even though the city manager was instructed, who works at the pleasure of the city commission, was instructed to implement those things. Hasn't been done. This is where it becomes a citizen's responsibility. Become aware of what your city has done. Become aware of the resolutions. Call your city commissioner and say, why hasn't this been done? You're paying, with your tax dollars, the city commissioner, I'm not the city commissioner, the city manager, a sizable salary to do that job. And if he's not doing it, and the city commission has spoken, they are your elected representatives. Those are the people who answer to you. Your votes matter, especially in this town. And Barbara, of course, can tell us just how important that process is. The opportunity here is for the citizens to push forward on things the city has already done. They have a sustainability committee that meets on a regular basis. Become part of that. Do your job as a citizen and allow your city to do what it has promised you it would do.
Well, I spent a good amount of time working on the city's climate action plan to reduce carbon emissions by 15% by 2015. And then wrote an implementation plan to ensure that that was implemented. There are hundreds of line items in that plan. It was very specific. It was created by a group of Key West citizens that met often for about a year, and a few of them are here tonight. And it's a good plan. It's a doable plan. The implementation plan is actually, most of it has to be implemented by the city of Key West, even though it's the citizens that have to do most of the work. But the city has to educate people so that they can know what to do. And that it's very specifically talks about that in the plan. Now, over that period of time, for the past 18 months since it was approved, the city has reduced carbon emissions tremendously. Not nearly where you have to be to get to 15% by 2015, but we've done a good job. They've designated a sum of money this year to spend on advertising and marketing, a very good sum of money for that. They've designated like 5 or 6 specific projects that are named in the climate action plan. What I suspect might happen is that the projects that are really important to people will get done, and the projects that are not very important will fall to the wayside, even though there's funding available. So the implementation plan needs to be followed up. For every item, there's a person, a department head who's responsible, and a date that that project is supposed to be started and completed by. So long as we have some follow-up and make sure that somebody's implementing all that plan, then we'll be well on our way to being a green city, within the city government and within the citizens, because both groups have to do their part.
Before we move on to Bert, I just want to mention that there are members of both that sustainability board and the people who put together the action plan in this audience and in this room tonight. We definitely have to get that work done. Okay, Bert, would you like for me to repeat your question?
Yes, please.
Do you feel Key West is putting enough emphasis on going green, and if not, what more should it do, and include the city itself, what it can do for itself as well as what the people need to do?
I don't know that it's possible to put enough emphasis on going green. I also don't know if it's possible to put enough emphasis on historic preservation. But I think the city is doing, I agree with Jed, that I think the city is doing a very good job. But it's the individuals, the members of the community, that are responsible for implementation and going green. We can write all the laws we want, it's a matter of enforcing it. If we want to properly implement it, and there are issues in the Florida Building Code, this is that handout again, that had to do with energy retrofitting, recommended and not recommended. the introduction says, prior to retrofitting historic buildings to make them more energy efficient, the first step should always be to identify and evaluate the existing historic features to assess their inherent energy conserving potential. Under roofs, it's recommended placing solar collectors on non-character defining roofs or roofs of non-historic adjacent buildings. It doesn't say that you can't put solar collectors on a historic structure. It says placing them on non-character defining roofs, not recommended. Placing solar collectors on roofs when such collectors change the historic roof line or obscure the relationship of the roof to character defining roof features such as dormers, skylights, and chimneys. And there is verbiage in here about a number of different things. Windows, there are 4 or 5 items. Entrances and porches, interior features, building site, masonry, wood, architectural metals. I'm giving you some time. Go ahead.
Well, I will pick up where he left off, and I will read to you what the HARC guideline says, and it's been in here, Jed, forever. The HARC has always accepted, not always, but in the last 5 years since I've been on the board, solar collectors, scuttles, and skylights on page 28 of the HARC guidelines. Number 1, new solar collectors, scuttles, and skylights should be flat mounted directly on the roof so that they do not destroy the roof line by protruding unduly from the surface of the roof, and can only be placed on roof surfaces not visible from a public right-of-way. Now that's interesting because, what you had said, Jed, was that the state law 16304 trumps deed restrictions and should be able to trump, the City of Key West guidelines here, except that these are national guidelines. These come from the federal government. Well, from the Secretary of the Interior, let's put it that way. But that is a federal law. That is a federal law.
You know what, and if I'll have a chance to respond, I'll hold my
Sure.
comments.
You will.
Okay, so, and then the other section was about you can't prevent even if it's visible from the public right-of-way. But then that would mean we could put swimming pools in the front yard of these old historic districts. That means we could take and put our garages right where the front porch ought to be. There has to be some reasonableness in what we're trying to do with our solar panels, with anything that we want to do with these devices, if we want to save this historic district. And when we start dismantling it, there is a point at which that after you take enough away from it, you can't be an historic district any longer. So you, the individuals, and this is the question, the city, are we doing enough to be green? Do we want to be so green that we don't want our historic district to look like the historic district it's been for 170 years?
That would be less green.
Pardon me?
That would be less
That would
green
be
if
less
you
green
did,
if we
if you
didn't
destroyed
stay
it.
with it.
May I respond, David?
You
I
can
feel-
respond in it within the context of the.
Absolutely. Barbara, you're wrong. It's not a federal law. It's a federal recommendation. It does not preempt state law. So you're dead wrong about that. With all due respect to your
So there
to
is
your
no
comments. Yeah.
foundation for these.
These are recommendations from the Department of Interior. They are not federal law. They have no preemptive effect. They have no prescriptive effect. So you're wrong about that. Straight up
I
wrong.
don't know that.
And second, well, I do know it.
Okay.
And second, the idea of putting, tell me how a swimming pool or garage qualifies as an energy saving device or a solar collector.
I'm looking at a swimming pool as something I can cool off with, just like an air conditioner can do it.
Okay. They don't qualify under the statute. So those are the things that's where common sense comes in.
But
So-
HARC has the guidelines that you can't put the swimming pools in.
Indeed, and their guidelines, those guidelines are different. They do not, they do not, those guidelines are different. They are not governed by 16304. We're talking about a very narrow application of that one issue.
Short rebuttal?
I'll allow, in this context, what I would prefer in the future is where you can try to work a rebuttal into an answer to another question. We're not going to just have a back and forth.
Which is what?
Right, I know, that's exactly what you did.
I want you to know this is the first time I've ever felt sorry for David.
But I'll allow Victor to speak, and then I'll allow another rebuttal to whatever you say too. So go ahead, if you'd like to.
Point of information, It's not a matter of federal law, but the Secretary of the Federal Department of DEP, Department
Environmental protection.
DEP, his name is Hawkins. He's a Nobel laureate. He's the only time we've had a real scientist head an agency of government. And he has set policy that all DEP buildings will have white roofs. Now, it doesn't carry the force of law, but it sets a national policy.
Would either of you like to respond to that?
Well, the only thing I want to say is that we're debating minutia. We should be focusing on the bigger concept of what it is we're trying to do. It doesn't matter if a white roof has a solar reflectance index that's higher than a silver roof. That's not the point of this discussion, but it should be broad concepts. Can we save our historic district and still be green? And in my opinion and the research that I've done, the answer is unequivocally yes. The Secretary of the Interior standards encourage you to be green. It's throughout the guidelines in the HARF guidelines, and to focus on whether a roof should be painted white should not be the point of this discussion.
To some extent.
Now it's really
that's part of what we're trying to resolve, because that has become an issue. But we'll continue with a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to let y'all respond to the audience after a couple more passes down the table. In this case, we'll start in the middle and go around towards this way and on around. And this question is, well, you've mentioned LEED certification. That stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. The LEED certification is sought out on most public and many private building projects these days. How important is this in the historic district, and how will it impact preservation? We've covered that to some extent, but I'd like to, if you want to.
Well, I don't necessarily think that LEED is the appropriate authority or building rating group that should be used for the state of Florida, or in the state of Florida. There's the Florida Green Building Coalition that specifically talks to buildings that are designed for the state of Florida. There's a big difference between a building in Minnesota and a building in Key West. There's humidity is completely different, and how things are built is different. So LEED doesn't cost that much more to make a building LEED versus non-LEED building. It might cost maybe 7 to 10% more. However, LEED doesn't necessarily make the building more energy efficient, because you could choose to use renewable products that are a one-time savings, or you could choose a very, very good air conditioning system that is an annual renewal where you're saving energy. So you can get points and still be LEED certified. Now with the Florida Green Building Council, it focuses a little bit more on your maintenance over the years and maintaining the building as an energy efficient structure.